Hello and welcome to a mathsy based video about the inner workings of my fantasy prediction series. My name is Alex as F1 Stuff and this video is going to be pure fantasy and my imagination. I really cannot stress this enough. If it seems stupid or silly, that's because it honestly is. It's just a lot of fun for me to work on these kind of random projects whilst everything is in lockdown in the UK due to Corona. So let's get started with how I create my custom tables and timings for this series. So the first thing I needed to do was to kind of create a way of adjusting each driver's single lap pace in a fairish and believable-ish sort of way, and thus my single lap delta was born, or the SLD for short. So I've taken 4 variables to calculate this: the 2020 test time the driver set, their difference to the 2019 test time, the tyres used in the 2020 test, and the amount of laps each driver drove. Each variable was then given a score, and these scores were totalled to create their unique SLD value. So we start with the difference from the 2 tests. I calculated the gain, or loss in some cases, each driver made, and then worked out a score based off of the biggest gainer. In this case, it was Verstappen. So this was simply done by dividing each difference by Verstappen's gain. The drivers with the plus by their name made a loss, so their score will be deducted from their final SLD value. Moving to the tyres used now, each compound the driver used for their fastest 2020 lap was given a percentage value. So the C5 was 100%, C4 80%, C3 60, and finally the C2 tyre was 40%. This percentage was then subtracted from 1 to give small incremental improvements for those drivers that were on the slower tyre. I did try numerous different iterations of all of these variables to try and give the best overall SLD value that I felt was the most believable. The time the driver set in the 2020 test was again worked out by taking a percentage from the fastest time. Bottas was first in the test, so he scored 100%, and then any driver slower scored a higher percentage, as a slower time is a larger number. I simply subtracted 100 from this percentage, and this score will be added on at the end, so the slower the driver in the test, the worse off they will be. Finally, I took into account the laps driven. Again, a percentage was made based off the driver who did the most laps. So in this case, Hamilton did, with 466 laps being set. The percentage was subtracted from 1, leaving a small tenth or lower score, which will then be deducted from the SLD value, with Hamilton gaining the most and Magnussen gaining the least. So then all of these values were added up and they gave this order here. So this will be the value I add or minus from each driver's single lap pace in every session. So that solves the issue of the single lap pace. I still had the issue of the race time. I couldn't simply use this value that I've just created to adjust their race time. I had to create a completely new variable. So my race time multiplier was born. So this uses 3 variables to calculate: the driver's SLD value, their qualifying position, and a randomly generated number. So the first step to creating the RTM value, I ranked the driver's current single lap delta time 1 through 20 and divided each of these by 10,000 and added 1. I only added 1 because it was easier for my brain to understand in my head when I multiplied out the race time at the very end. So next I took into account the qualifying session. This was after the SLD values had been applied and the new order was assigned for that race. The drivers were assigned a number 1 through 20 and then their qualifying position was divided by 100,000. This was because I felt each driver's improvement from last year's to this year had more weight than their qualifying result on the race outcome. Finally, a random number 1 through 20 was assigned to each driver to give the simulation of luck. So after a few attempts without this third variable, it became a bit too predictable for my liking. So I added it in and divided it by 1,000 to give it a little bit more weight than the other variables. So Mercedes gets victory, takes victory comfortable over everybody else. However, this random number ends up being quite high, their new race time will be a lot slower, and they would end up having a poor race and dropping down the order a bit. So then all of these values were then added together to give the drivers unique RTM values. Then obviously these would be unique for every single race weekend, unlike the SLD values which will stay throughout the season. So I'll just run through a quick example now. So for the single lap delta, if Lando Norris in the McLaren sets a 1 minute 30.200 in a real life session, I would then take his current SLD value, which was 0.466, and add it to give a new single lap time of a 1 minute 30.666. This would then be done for every single lap time there is for Norris in all 3 practice sessions, all 3 qualifying sessions, and his fastest lap in the race. Then obviously I'd repeat that for every single driver. So the race time multiplier, it's a little bit more complicated, but still fairly straightforward. So again, if Lando Norris sets a race time, of 1 hour, 25 minutes, 30 seconds dead, I couldn't just multiply this by the RTM straight away, I had to convert it to seconds. And that gave us 5,130 seconds for the race, which to be honest doesn't seem like that many seconds. Anyway, this value is then multiplied through by his unique RTM value, and that gives us 5,150.3148, which I then convert back to hours and minutes, which gives us a total of 1 hour, 25 minutes, 50 seconds, 0.315, and that is now Norris's new race time. Simple. So I hope everyone followed the maths there. It was just a quick rundown of the process that I go through in creating all of the unique tables to give the single lap pace for the practice, qualifying and the fastest lap, and then also how I adjust the race pace as well. Moving on to some assumptions now though. It can't be make-believe without a few assumptions. So this is what a typical leaderboard after a Grand Prix looks like. So this is the 2019 Australian Grand Prix results sheet from the BBC. So first, if we take a look at the fastest lap, I'd apply the SLD to each of these, giving a new leaderboard and handing out the bonus point to the person in first. And then moving to the race time, this is converted to seconds, like in the example for every lead lap finisher, and then the RTM is applied to these values. At the points that the drivers start to get lapped, here it's Hulkenberg, I've simply taken their fastest lap with the SLD applied and added that to the race leader's lap time. So then I can display every driver's gap to the leader and the interval to the car in front, even if they have been lapped. Moving down all the way to where we get to people that are 2 and 3 laps down, I then multiplied their race, their fastest lap according to how many laps down they were. So Russell, here he would have 2 versions of his fastest lap added onto the race leader, and Kubica would have 3 lots of his fastest lap added onto the race leader. The same treatment is done for the non-finishers, as they have set a lap time which I can then apply my SLD value to, and this basically negates any of the DNFs that did occur last year, and it will put them back into the order and I can use them in my prediction. So moving on now to some driver assumptions. So in 2019, Hulkenberg and Kubica were back on the grid, but for 2020 and my prediction videos, Ocon and Latifi are here. I have simply just replaced Hulkenberg's times with Ocon and Kubica's times with Latifi. It's as simple as that. I couldn't find another way of slotting them in. It's just a straight swap. However, that is not the end to the drivers' issues. So at the start of 2019, Gasly was driving for the Red Bull and Albon in the Toro Rosso, now the AlphaTauri. So this changed after the summer break as the 2 drivers were swapped. So as my SLD values were calculated using the testing times of the drivers in their different cars to what they're in now, I've opted to keep Gasly in the Red Bull and Albon in the AlphaTauri for the first half and switch them halfway through the season, exactly like 2019, rather than keeping Albon in the Red Bull for my prediction, as he'd be way down the order. I really hope that makes sense. It does in my head. I've tried to write it down as best as I can in order to sort of give the best explanation possible. And finally, for the assumptions, we move to retirements. Any retirement made on lap 1 in the 2019 season will unfortunately have to stay retired on lap 1, as I cannot accurately predict their new race time. And super finally, Excel will then choose a random number between 1 and 5, and these drivers will retire. I'll then run a spinny wheel name picker thingy. I'll pop a doodah little screenshot of the spinny wheel thingy picker doodah that I use on here, and that simply just picks the names of the available drivers that are to retire. And there we go. That's hopefully all of the maths and assumptions that I've made to create this series, and also hopefully you followed all of my madness and imagination. I don't think I've missed anything, but if I have, I might make a follow-up video. I'll catch you guys in the next one.